If you were in some of the other sessions today or last night, there was a lot of pretty heavy-duty science. This will mostly just be factoids and pretty pictures, stuff like that. So if you have eaten any mushrooms recently, you'll really like this talk. I have a lot of really exciting imagery and stuff, so settle in. So we'll take a look at some of the psychotropic groups of mushrooms, primarily the genus Psilocybe, overview of the genus, a little bit about the taxonomy, lookalikes, some facts, some myths, history of their discovery, a little bit about the chemistry. We have a whole bunch of experts, world experts here, so not a lot about that, not a lot about the use or clinical use or law. I'll mention some of these things, but again, there's a whole bunch of experts here. If you did miss their talks, there'll be a panel discussion tomorrow, so they're the people to ask on stuff like that, as well as current research as a therapeutic. Okay, so genus Psilocybe are what we mycophiles call LBMs, little brown mushrooms. They are pretty hard to identify, even for experts, because LBMs all look very similar. They're pretty widespread. There's over 400 species worldwide of Psilocybe and a very similar genus Diconica, which I'll explain in just a second. If you look for mushrooms, it's likely you've seen them, but it's, again, really hard to tell them from other LBMs. So your chances, frankly, of actually finding and eating any species of active mushrooms are pretty low. And there's a number of species that look real similar that are quite toxic. So I don't really recommend it. Plus, there's seemingly so many people growing them these days that, you can get them elsewhere. Some characteristics, how would you identify them? Okay, so LBMs, but they also have an appearance that's not super widespread amongst mushrooms in that it's, the cap, in addition to being brown or very pale tan, almost white in a lot of species, will have a hygroscopic appearance, sort of a water-soaked appearance. If you've seen plants that in periods of frost, when it's cold, what happens with the frost is it freezes some of the cells and they burst and the water leaks out, so they have a water-soaked look. With a hygroscopic situation, they look water-soaked, but it's really not from that same thing going on as with plants. What happens is there's a very thin skin, the pileopellis, on the surface of a mushroom. That's the external most part of mycelium, and the layer right under that, as it starts aging and drying, the skin kind of falls down differently onto that lower layer and makes one area look darker than the other, so it looks a little water soaked. Not a lot of mushrooms do that, so that's kind of a good character to notice. They have purple-black spores, and then a little factoid there about liberty caps. One of the most famous of all the Psilocybe mushrooms is the Psilocybe simulantiata, which is the liberty cap. It gets its name because it looks like this symbol of revolution, and in fact it's been used a lot in government buildings and seals. Even on some of the United States federal seals has images of liberty caps on them. No joke. Totally illegal, but still on government logos. So spore prints, if you're a newbie to wild mushrooming, one of the ways that you can correctly identify some of the mushrooms you're picking, especially if you're picking for the table, is to do a spore print before you put anything in your mouth, and that can be very helpful. There's a lot of mushrooms with white spore prints, so that's not as helpful as some of the more oddball colors like pink or cream or yellow, and in this case, kind of a purple-black. There's a few different mushrooms that have kind of a purple-black spore print, but not all that many, and Psilocybes are one. Some of the other things about them in nature. Psilocybes are saprobic. They're not mycorrhizal with trees or other plants, so they are a rotter. Very few are saprobic on animal dung or manure. A lot of people know about Psilocybe cubensis, which does grow in dung, and a couple others. But oftentimes people are out looking in pastures for Psilocybes in the Midwest and other places where they just simply don't occur. While we do have active species in the Midwest, that's not where they occur. Most Psilocybes are rotters of organic material, wood chips, dead trees and things like that. So upshot is if you are expecting to find them looking in pastures, that's probably not the best place to look because most of them don't really grow in dung anyway. Another myth is about the blue staining color. As you can imagine, if you're a 4A leader, which I am very often in identifying mushrooms, people are coming to you with mushrooms that will have color reactions when they're handled or bruised or cut. And a common color reaction with certain groups of mushrooms is a blue staining reaction. And people know about, those one mushrooms that stain blue. Is this big bolete magic mushroom? And no, it's not. It's just that a lot stain blue. So one myth is that the surefire way to tell active species is by blue color reaction, and that's not true. What is true is that of the active species like Psilocybe, most of them do turn blue when handled or damaged or bruised, or even under sort of adverse climatological conditions. So that does sort of indicate that they are active if it's in one of those groups. And then there's that final note at the bottom about all mushrooms, when eaten raw, are mostly indigestible, and we just had a little mini discussion a couple lectures ago about that. So keep in mind, if you get sick from eating any wild mushrooms, if you ate a lot of them raw, it doesn't necessarily mean they're poisonous. It just means there's a lot of fiber there, and it's tough to digest, and you can get sick. I mean, you can get sick from eating a basket full of apples. It doesn't mean they're poisonous. It's just that there's a lot of indigestible matter there. So keep that in mind with mushrooms for the table or whatever, that they are more easily digestible if they are cooked. Another thing about mushrooms is most of them are about 90% water. So when you're collecting king boletes or whatever, and you got a lot picked this season, so a good way to preserve them is slice them and put them on the dryer. When you put your boletes or whatever mushrooms on the dryer, they're going to dry down and be a lot smaller in weight. And most of the material there that you're ingesting when you eat fresh mushrooms is water. Some other things to know about mushrooms. While there is definitely a danger of being poisoned and even dying from mushrooms, people die every year from eating wild mushrooms, so it is something to be serious about. Your chances of eating dangerous mushrooms and killing yourself is actually pretty small, because there's really just not that many dangerous species. And likewise, there's about that many species that are really palatable too. There's really not that many that are really tasty and good to eat. So sort of the upshot of this slide is, if you don't know anything about mushrooms and you go out in the woods on a foray tomorrow and pick everything you find and put it in your basket, bring it home and eat it, the chances of you dying from anything in there is pretty low. It's not zero, but it's pretty low. The chances of you having really, really good stuff to eat is also pretty low. There's just a lot of mushrooms that are of poor quality because of poor taste or texture. They're hard and woody. I mean, you can't eat those. Join a mycological society or mushroom club in your area. Find some experts to take you out and show you what's what, and your chances of, first of all, not bringing home poisonous stuff and killing your guests, which is embarrassing, but also treating them to something that's really good, is a lot higher if you learn the mushrooms. You know that the chances of dying are pretty low if you go on any of the mushroom group Facebook pages when people are quite literally wanting to eat anything, and they're posting photos. What is this? And they'll be, I think I know pretty much all the academic mycologists in North America, because there's not that many. So there'll be several people chiming in with authority that it's absolutely this, and then someone else will say, no, that's absolutely not right. It's this other thing that looks nothing like it. And I'm looking at the picture, and I know mushrooms pretty good. I don't know what's in the picture, and furthermore, I don't know the two so-called experts that are suggesting this person eat this thing. So people are eating a lot of junk out there and seemingly not ending up dead. So it's, fortunately, it's not, it's probably not as dangerous as we might think. But anyways, word to the wise. Okay, so one thing about these compounds, psilocybin and psilocin, as odd and strange as they are, that we've been hearing from some of the experts here, the even stranger thing still is that they've seemingly evolved several times within several sort of disparate groups of mushrooms. So of course, the genus Psilocybe is notorious for having psilocybin and psilocin, but some other disparate groups that aren't that closely related to Psilocybe and Stropharias. So Conocybe, Gallerina, Inocybe, there's Pluteus, and I'll even show pictures of some of these that are active species in other genera. So what's going on and what's with these compounds? No one really knows. I'll show a thing about some of the chemistry, and it just seems that these are probably compounds in the pathways to create all sorts of other pretty commonly and widely used chemicals within the mushroom physiology. And I sort of hinted at a lot of people think they can go out and find magic mushrooms, and it's actually pretty hard. I look for them all the time, just out of scientific curiosity, of course. And and it's pretty hard. There's a lot of stuff that looks very, very similar to magic mushrooms, so just be on guard, and I'll show you some pictures of some things now. So again, just a little refresher course. Here's some of the things to look for, sort of a buff or brown colored, purple-black spores, a ring on the stem, or sometimes no ring, an umbo, which is that little bump on the top of the cap, and that's what gives the Liberty cap its name, and then that they're saprobic. So they're not going to be growing off of living trees. They're not mycorrhizal. They're growing on rotting debris. Okay, so the first one is a favorite of mine because it comes from the East, and this is a magic mushroom that wasn't even known to science until just a few decades ago. I give you Psilocybe ovoidiocystidiata, great name. Everyone's probably heard of ovoids. Yeah, so this mushroom wasn't really known to science until I think it was the 80s. It was discovered in Ohio. It grows in really unusual habitat for psilocybes, but in my experience, it's extremely common in the East. And another unusual thing about it is it comes out in early in the year, so spring, maybe right after morel season. And most psilocybes tend to come out quite a bit later or even the end of the year. Anyways, it pops up in places that are often very, very wet also, which is unusual. So places along streams, almost kind of swampy and trashy and wet. And in this situation, this was at an amusement park on a water ride. And this was this was right along the walkway. I didn't take this picture, by the way, but this was right along the walkway where everyone was just standing along the railing waiting for their turn to go on the water ride. And there's a lot of water leaking from the ride and rotting wood and stuff. I mean, it was within arm's reach of where everyone was. I guess if they had turned around and looked at it, they're, I guess, breaking the law because, these are federally controlled substance. Okay, so the next guy, this is not a psilocybe, but this is a very common Stropharia. This was actually taken in Telluride several years ago. And you see this one a lot, Stropharia ambigua. It gets the name because of its ambiguous appearance. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes really large and tall, and apparently it's all the same mushroom. But I always think they look a lot like Psilocybe cubensis. They're about the right size and status. You see the ring on it and the dark spore print. And, it is a fairly close relative of Psilocybe cubensis. Of course, it's not active, but it's still a very pretty mushroom. Here's another Stropharia. It's a Stropharia Alysus, which grows on moose dung. I took this shot in Newfoundland. The scientific name of moose is Alces alces, so that's how it gets the name. This also looks a lot like a Psilocybe, but again, it's not. It's just a very common kind of saprobic mushroom, a Stropharia. Here's a Paniolus, and Paniolus are also kind of close to Psilocybes, and some of them are reported to be active. I've not personally experienced that. I think they're very weakly active, but I don't think this one is. But a common kind of little saprobe growing on lawns, and there's some other Paniolus and Paniolina that grow on lawns, which is kind of a common habitat for some species of Psilocybe. It's a cute little mushroom, kind of delicate. The stem's kind of tough, but the cap's kind of delicate. Dark spore print. This one, of course, looks nothing like a Psilocybe, but it does have psilocybin, at least in eastern populations. This is the so-called big laughing gem. Is anyone familiar with this one, seeing it? So some hands going up. Has anyone eaten this one and experienced activity? Yeah. So some of these big laughing gems, Gymnopolis spectabilis is the name I learned. It's now mostly called Gymnopolis junionius. I have experienced these to be a little bit active, and in fact, there was an episode where I was going to give a lecture at the annual foray in Missouri, which is where NAMA's going to be next year. Yay! I'm not going to say who, but someone, a very good friend of mine, dosed everyone in the audience before my talk, and it was maybe the most memorable talk I've ever had. I was not dosed, but I could say anything or nothing, and it was funny as hell. So I was really on that night. I think the slides even ran out, and they were still just carrying on. It was pretty cool. This is one of my favorite mushrooms to see because it's beautiful. It's a great big wood rotter that grows in clusters, kind of an orange color. And it's one of my favorite smelling mushrooms. If you smell the gills, it smells like bitter almond, at least in the East. It's a wonderful smelling mushroom. I don't recommend eating it. I mean, you can. It's not really dangerous. I don't recommend eating it because it's incredibly bitter. It's like one of the most bitter substances you can bite into. If you have certain pills or NoDoz or something, and you accidentally get stuck on your tongue and you bite it or something, you have like that bitter taste for like days. Yeah, that's what this tastes like. So there's a little brown mushroom that you would not want to mistake for Psilocybes. This is the deadly Gallerina. Gallerinas get their toxin from a poison that has evolved more than once. They have amatoxins just like the deadly Amanitas, even though they're very distantly related. So how to know deadly Gallerinas? They grow on rotting wood, especially very well rotten wood. There's some other Gallerinas that might grow in other situations, but the deadly Gallerina grows on very well rotten wood, has a rust brown spore print, so not a purple-black spore print like the Psilocybes. And we saw these a few times on the early bird foray and some other rust brown mushrooms. So if you were on the early bird foray, what was one of the rules of thumb you learned? Don't eat rust brown spored mushrooms unless you're really, really good at identifying mushrooms, because there are some dangerous species that have rust brown spore print. These grow oftentimes right in and amongst honey mushrooms. So if you're especially from the east, where honey mushrooms are widely picked and quite popular, I suspect when people get poisoned by these tiny little mushrooms, it's probably they're just grabbing handfuls of honey mushrooms off the tree, and these were maybe growing in with them, and that's how they get poisoned. I don't recommend eating honey mushrooms either because they're gross. Oh, is this mic on? I'm sorry. Here's another interesting group of kind of little grass and out-of-the-way growers, Canosibes or Foliotinas. Some of these are active. I don't recommend eating any of them because there's also some deadly ones in this group. But the active Canosibes, you can see these guys have bluing on the stem. Beautiful looking bluing mushrooms with brown spore print. And here's a Canosibe that is deadly poisonous from the west coast, Philaris. You know, for all intents and purposes, if you don't know mushrooms really, really well, this looks quite a bit like a Psilocybe. Another group, Inosibes, a lot of people online on Arrowwood or at forays ask me about Inosibes because it's known or at least thought that some Inosibes have psilocybin. It's also well known that I think all Inosibes, or at least most, have muscarin, which is quite poisonous. This species here in particular, this is Calamistrata, Inocybe calamistrata. This is pretty common in the east, and it's one of the bigger ones, and it does have a bluing base on it, so very often people ask me about this one. Is this one of the ones that's active? I see the bluing base, and this is not active, even though it has a blue staining base to it, but it is for certain to be toxic, so again, not something to confuse with a Psilocybe. This one was one we just found just a month ago. It's not all that uncommon, but it's a little mushroom, and people don't collect little mushrooms. This is Mycena amicta. It's a beautiful Mycena. There's not many Mycenas really that are that pretty, frankly. And this one, in my opinion, reminds me a lot of Psilocybes because it starts out very blue when it's young, but you almost never see it very blue. You usually see it like this or like these other ones because the blue fades really quickly in the day, so it just has a little bit of bluing on it, almost like it's bruising like a Psilocybe would, but it's not. It's just that the bluing color is going away. So if you see them in a really good textbook, they might have some really nice specimens with the blue color, which is really pretty, but you almost never see it like that because it goes away really quickly. Has anyone ever seen this one? This is a Pluteus that is active. Yeah, and this was from Fermilab, by the way, in Batavia. Where's the Batavia resident here? Yes. There's another person from the little village I live in, Batavia, Illinois. And so she would obviously know where Fermilab is. It's a great place to foray because they have a lot of grounds, but it's also a very famous place where there's an atom smasher and they do all that sort of stuff. If you're into wild mushrooms, Pluteus are one of the groups that most people are not very excited with. They're medium to kind of large mushrooms that grow on rotting wood. They don't have a lot of features. They're mostly brown or white. There's some really attractive ones, but they're not that common. Mostly you see brown or white ones. They're not very good to eat. They're very bland. They have a pink spore print, so the gills turn pink, as you can see in this one, kind of. It's a little dark. So it kind of helps to identify them. But there is a species in the east, Pluteus americanus. Older books will call it Pluteus salicinus, which is actually a European one. But in any case, they are active. You can see when it's handled, the stem does get blue. From my own personal experience, I don't know how many you have to eat to experience anything, because I think it's quite a lot. But anyways, they do have psilocybin in them. And then finally, everyone's favorite mushroom, Amanita Muscaria, which does not have psilocybin at all, but I just threw it in here because, everyone likes to see Amanita Muscaria. So these, of course, are considered entheogenic, or at least a deliriant to some people. But they are toxic, and they will make you sick and sleepy, and frankly, it's not really a choice for tripping, in my opinion. They're strikingly beautiful, very widespread in nature, and they have a very important role in nature, of course. And amanitas are my favorite group of mushrooms, so I quite love to see them, but they're not one I would recommend as a psychedelic. Okay, so here's some fun to ridiculous myths. All of them I've been asked about more than one time, so it's not something that like some real kook asked me. It's just regular kooks that ask me these questions. So, of course, psychedelic mushrooms are, at least psilocybes, are not toxic, addictive, a gateway drug or anything. That's, of course, ridiculous. Equally ridiculous is under their listing that they have no potential for medicinal use when, of course, not only do they have medicinal use, but they were used medicinally for quite a few years until they were outlawed. Especially in Canada, there were tens of thousands of patients treated with psilocybin quite a long time ago. So that seems nonsensical. We already covered that they don't always grow on dung. In fact, most species do not grow on dung. All mushrooms that stain blue are psychedelic. That's false. Here's a real pretty bolete Gyroporus cyanescens that turns electric blue instantly. It's spectacular. And it's a tasty edible too, by the way. All mushrooms with psychedelic effects are safe to ingest. That's also not true. I showed several that do have psilocybin, but that are poisonous. And those were in other genera. And then probably the most ridiculous myth that I've ever been confronted with is that magic mushrooms glow in the dark. And to my knowledge, none of them do. But a fair number of mushrooms do glow in the dark. This is a photo of Mycena lucentipes that was sent to me by a mycologist in California, Brian Perry. And he works on bioluminescent mushrooms in the tropics and other parts of the world. So this one is a real famous one for glowing. So in any case, those are some of the myths. How about some of the history of psilocybe? We've had several talks about where some of these things come from and where research has come from. So they have sort of outlined a lot of the same things I have here to show you. But in any case, for those that weren't in some of those talks, here we go. We have not a lot of good data on it, but we do have imagery from different peoples from a long time ago that have left all sorts of different art images in caves and elsewhere seem to depict people using magic mushrooms from a long time ago. So one argument against this, and I, at least up till several years ago, was guilty of as well, is that I really didn't believe a lot of these reports just because we didn't really have a lot of evidence that we had some of these psychedelic mushrooms outside of the Americas. But that was all disproven in a very spectacular paper by Laura Guzman-Davalos, who came here to Telluride. That's her, famous mycologist from Central America. She works with a number of different groups of mushrooms. If the name Guzman is familiar to you, it's because pretty much the father of psilocybe was her father, Gaston Guzman. That's the dapper individual there on the far left. This paper that they put out was quite spectacular and traced some of the origins of the genus Psilocybe and does show that these mushrooms have moved all around the planet, and we do have other species outside the Americas. So it certainly could be plausible that people have used them, for a long time, even before modern humans. The best data we know of people using them a long time ago does come from Central America and are still being used to this day. They weren't used recreationally. They were used more, strictly spiritually as divinatory mushrooms. The name Tionanacatl means like flesh of the gods. And we know that people were using them back then because when the Europeans arrived, they actually documented ceremonies with people using them. The Catholic missionaries, of course, tried to snuff all this out because it was heretic and sinful and just, in general, awful, and they didn't understand it. They were not successful. They got rid of a lot of the artwork and stuff like that, but not all of it. And in fact, some of that exists to this day. And in fact, some of the ceremonies exist to this day in remote parts of Central America. And we've even had some wise women come here to Telluride in the past and perform ceremonies. This was Grandma Julieta, right, Art? Yeah, this was Grandma Julieta, and she just passed away, I think, last year. So this photo was shot here at Telluride. So for sure, this has sort of outlasted the oppression of the Westerns coming in. and still exists to this day. That the people were using them in Central America was discovered, so to speak, in the 1950s by Gordon Wasson, and no doubt everyone in here has heard of Gordon Wasson and his wife, famous mycophile. He was a banker in New York City, I think worked for Citibank, and was a mycophile and liked to go out mushrooming with friends and whatnot, like everybody here. But unlike probably a lot of people here, certainly unlike me, had very deep pockets. So when he heard of rumors of people far, far away using some sort of really strange mushrooms that did strange things physiologically to the mind, he decided he would spare no expense and travel to seek these things out. And made repeated trips to Central America, and then on the third trip actually got to get involved with a curandera, Maria Sabina, who took him in and allowed him to partake in a ceremony. And of course it was a life-altering experience for Gordon Wasson, and he wanted to tell the world about it. So he had friends everywhere, sent off a article he wrote up to what was then an extremely popular magazine, Life, and they read this thing and said, nope, no way, this is too freaky. So it's reported that he then ended up paying them a lot of money to publish it, and it was I guess the only article he ever got paid to publish in the journal. It turned out to be way more popular than the publishers of Life could have ever imagined, because basically the next day after this thing hit the newsstands, there was a wave of tourists heading to Central America to seek this thing out. And it's really unfortunate because Maria Sabina, you can imagine, probably suffered a lot of hardship from her community that was then inundated with all of these gringos coming in looking to party and get high. And I assume she probably suffered a lot of grief, and really, until very recently, really got no notoriety or thanks whatsoever for bringing this to the attention of the West. So I have mixed feelings on the whole thing. It was great, mycologically speaking, but I'm sure culturally it didn't do much for the people in Central America. Okay, so let's take a step back and get to some of the pioneers of all of this research, some of my heroes, and especially Richard Evans Schulte's my favorite hero of all time. It was an incredible honor when last spring I was invited to give 2 lectures at Harvard University in the very building where Richard Evans Schulte's worked, and I got to see the herbarium and everything. It was just astounding. Schulte's did research on all sorts for his doctoral work as well as academically after his doctorate, on all sorts of psychedelic and psychotropic plants, as they were all pretty much called then. Of course, Psilocybe is a mushroom, not a plant, but they were all sort of called plants back then. He traveled all around looking at all sorts of things. You can see the list there: ayahuasca and peyote and morning glories. In 1956, Roger Heim, a famous French scientist, he was the first to identify the mushrooms that people like Wasson as well as Schulte's had brought back from Central America. And Heim put the name Psilocybe on these groups and even assigned names to some of them. Then shortly thereafter, Albert Hofmann, famous chemist at Sandoz, who was the first to isolate and purify LSD, also was the first to isolate and purify the active compounds from Psilocybe mushrooms. And that's him pictured there in the middle. And those are the 2 compounds, psilocybin and psilocin. Shortly after that, Timothy Leary, who, of course, everyone has heard of at Harvard University, got wind of all this, and he, thought this was pretty astounding, some of the effects of this drug or this chemical on the minds of people, and started doing some experiments with others at Harvard University, mostly graduate students at first, and things started to go downhill from there because the school administrators started hearing about, their sons and daughters taking part in these tripping parties with professors and things. And a number of their studies done in the Northeast that were discussed earlier by some of our experts here. One was at the Concord Prison experiment, and that's a picture of the Concord State Prison there in Concord, Massachusetts. This was one of the more famous studies done by Timothy Leary and Ram Das. So As the experiments, so-called, grew and grew, words getting out, there was an undergrad who worked for the Harvard student newspaper who approached Timothy Leary and said he wanted to get in on this too, and how could he sign up? And was told by Timothy Leary, no, this is serious stuff. Only scientists and graduate students are allowed to partake in this. And this male undergrad student, said, well, I know for a fact some female friends of mine that were allowed to take part. And so there was sort of a fight and some snubbing. And so when Andy Weil, one of the founders of the Telluride Mushroom Festival, published the story in the newspaper, it was not there long thereafter that Leary and Albert were both dismissed from Harvard and had to take it on the road. And, the Summer of Love then was underway. Some other famous people in the history of the research of these mushrooms: Terence and Dennis McKenna. Dennis was just here a couple years ago. I don't know if anyone saw him. It was spectacular. Terence, of course, is very famous as sort of the very outspoken cheerleader of psychedelic mushrooms and sort of popularizing it with a lot of people, while Dennis was a lot more quiet and was the scientist of the two, and did a lot of research and still does research to this day. He's world famous chemist that's worked on a lot of different psychedelic fungi as well as plants. It was very exciting to talk with him and to hear him do lectures here a couple years ago. We'll have to have him back. Another person involved with those two, Kat Harrison, has also been here to Telluride to give lectures, and she did the artwork in this extremely famous book that probably several people in the audience have. It's still around, circulating. So I often get requests to do presentations on psychedelic mushrooms and things like that, so it's hard for me not to have pictures of Terence McKenna. Next up, Michael Pollan. So speaking of popularizing and evangelizing, probably nothing in the last several years has done more to sort of popularize, or at least pique interest within a whole new community out there with regards to psilocybe than Michael Pollan's book that just came out. This was very mainstream and has got a lot of discussion going on magic mushrooms, the use of psychedelic compounds for treatment. It was a really well done book. So one of these days he'll come here. I email with him back and forth. He's very interested in this event, of course. So in fact, he just sent me an email the other day asking how the thing was going. So we'll have him here one of these days. Next up is back to Gaston Guzman. Again, sort of the father of psilocybe research. He's named a lot of species, a lot of publications and monographs on the genus. So he's one of the all-time greats. Michael Bugh, this is what he looks like now, a very good friend of mine. Michael Bugh is not, Gaston Guzman was not really a proponent of eating magic mushrooms, and neither is Michael Bugh. Michael Bugh is probably the world's most famous or foremost authority on the chemistry of these mushrooms, and is pretty much the person who worked out the percentage of activity and the weight of the compounds in all of these mushrooms, because he's a chemist was a chemist at Evergreen State College. But despite the fact that he spent a long time working on them, he was really not a proponent and only ate magic mushrooms once ever, and wasn't a fan. So there you go. Some other interesting factoids about Michael Bugh: probably more species of psilocybe have been found growing outdoors, not indoors, but growing outdoors at his property than any other place in the world. And when I asked him why this is, he's confounded, but he said after years and years of coming home every day and sort of dumping his dirty clothes and shaking out his lab coat and stuff at the front door, he just figured he was dropping a lot of spores in all of the flower beds, and he has stuff growing all around his house. He grows fruit trees and flowers and vegetables and stuff. So there's a very conducive area for a lot of psilocybes, but there's been lots of species that have been documented on his property. Kind of interesting. Michael Bugh was a professor at Evergreen State College all the way back since the very beginning of when Evergreen was formed, and it was sort of a radical college when it was founded at the time, and ended up producing quite a few kind of progressive thinking scientists, one of which was one of Michael Bugh's students, his master's student, Paul Stamets. You saw him in the movie last night. And Paul Stamets, pretty much the authority on psilocybe in modern times, because he's written two of the most widely read books on the species of Psilocybe. And if you were at the movie, was everyone at the movie last night? Yeah, it was spectacular. We saw Paul a lot, and of course, this is what he looks like today. This isn't what he looked like back in his evergreen college days, but I do have a picture, of course. That's what Paul Stamets used to look like. That's, I don't know what he's doing, but I'm sure he's cooking up something in his kitchen. So this is an authorized photo. He gave it to me and said, enjoy. So anyways, that's where Stamets got his start, was with Michael Bugh, and he's very close friends with Michael Bugh to this day and thinks very fondly of him because Bugh is very smart and taught Paul all the chemistry he knows. Paul was just here last year and gave some spectacular lectures, including this one. This shot was taken up in Mountain Village in the conference center there, where it was, it seats 700, and there was standing room only in there. It was quite an affair. He really brings them in. And that was exciting. I'm sure he'll be back again at some point in the future. So one other source to mention on information about Psilocybe. This is sort of a shameless plug for the magazine that I publish. We had a yay. We had a special issue devoted to the science of Psilocybe. We do special issues all the time on all sorts of things. This one was on Psilocybe mushrooms. And despite this being a completely verboten topic in all the mycological circles, the mycological journals, the academic journals, NAMA and other NAMA club publications, restrict any mention of the word Psilocybe. This issue, I'm here to tell you, is, as best as anyone can tell, the single most sold issue of a mycological journal ever in history. It's been incredibly popular because people, they want to know about stuff. They want to know, this is information. It's not dangerous to know, of course, so people want to know. So some other of the fathers of this sort of research, the famous Albert Hofmann, another a hero of mine, a brilliant chemist who discovered his problem child. His problem child was lysergic acid diethylamide, which is also produced by a fungus. I think I have a photo coming up maybe in a couple slides. And anyways, the fungus, it's not really known why fungi produce these compounds. I mean, it's been suggested that maybe they are anti-feedants to insects and things like that, and that's possible. In the case of Psilocybe mushrooms, I can tell you that they do get, my area of interest is studying mycophagus or mushroom-eating flies. So like those beetles that are in your boletes, that's actually what I study, I'm embarrassed to say. So, and Psilocybes get all of the same flies that all of the other mushrooms get. If you've never seen any maggots or maggot tunnels in your Psilocybe mushrooms, that's because they were grown indoors where flies can't get to them. But if you had Psilocybe cubensis grown outdoors, they would have maggots in them just like your boletes and all of the other mushrooms that you're picking here at the foray. I don't know if it's an anti-feedant or if it's just something else going on. With lysergic acid, it is a very bitter alkaloid, and it's quite toxic too, by the way. So if you find natural ergot in the wild, I wouldn't recommend eating it because it's extremely poisonous. But you would also find out that it's very bitter in your mouth, and you probably have a gag reflex. So it is possible that lysergic acid is meant as an anti-feedant because of where the fungus grows on the plant. Up on the seed head, grazing animals might come along and eat it and spit that back out. So I could get that might be some sort of a defense compound that this fungus evolved. Anyways, Albert Hofmann was working with different forms of lysergic acid and finding some were more or less efficacious in his different lab settings. One, LSD-25, is the one that was stolen and released widely, and everyone started eating it and started the Summer of Love. So that was the sample 25. That's why it has the little number on it there. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands if you've eaten LSD-25. Here's a picture of the fungus in its natural state. So this fungus, Claviceps purpurea, or ergot, grows on a number of different types of cereal grasses. There's lots of ergots. This is a huge genus. In fact, it's a huge group of ascomycete fungi. And hopefully, you've been out on a foray or gone down to the ID table or saw Ken Kessenbrock's lecture where you can kind of learn a little bit about different types of mushrooms and basidiomycetes and ascomycetes and why they're different. And it comes down to how their spores are released in any case. So This fungus is more closely related, believe it or not, to things like morels and yeasts and things like that, and less closely related to things like Psilocybe and Amanita. In any case, the compound obviously is quite similar in its effect when it gets inside of a human. This slide here, which I really love, was created by one of our Fungi magazine tricksters, David Rose, who writes for us a lot, and he likes to talk about psychedelics a lot, and he's been here as a lecturer. So we celebrate the day when Albert Hofmann sort of accidentally dosed himself while freely handling, and then ingesting LSD, and wasn't feeling so good, so he decided to quit work early about midday and ride his bike on home, and had a massive trip on the way home, and described that to the world, basically. And so that day, April 19th, 1943, is known as Bicycle Day. On Facebook and other social media, people will be, of course, celebrating the day. I'm not exactly sure what you are supposed to do on Bicycle Day. I guess ride a bicycle on 5 grams. And so anyways, has everyone heard of Bicycle Day? Yeah, of course. This is Telluride. This isn't the Wisconsin Mycological Society. This is Telluride. So what goes on when you ingest these psychotropic compounds? Well, this is probably the single best definition or explanation. This was coined by Nicholas Money in one of his books, and it goes, mushrooms demonstrate quite convincingly that gods are figments of the hominid imagination. After ingestion, psilocybin is converted into psilocin. Psilocin is remarkably similar in chemical structure to serotonin, and when it reaches the brain, it docks with serotonin receptors, upsets the normal functioning of the neocortex, and conjures angels from thin air. I think that's a great way of explaining it, and it's extremely ironic that it should have been written by Nick Money, because he's a complete poo-pooer of all things psychedelic. If you've read any of his books, some of which are some of my favorite mycological books of all time, none of them really talk about psychotropic mushrooms. They talk about all the other groups of mushrooms, but never psychotropic. If you ask him, he'll almost respond violently about, like, why would you deign to even ask me about such things? So he's definitely not a proponent of these sorts of things. So that was Money's explanation. Everyone has sort of a personal explanation of what they've experienced if they've just eaten something psychotropic. I can't really put it into words. It's one of those things, but I can show you. Would you like to see? So this this is your brain on mushrooms. This was another really, really poignant quote that I saw. I forget where I saw it. Anyways, the way I describe mushrooms to people who've never done them is that alcohol and pot change how you feel. Mushrooms change how you think. I thought that was really apropos. So many say that this is sort of a mystical experience to experience these drugs. And the previous experts that were here described this really, really super well, so I'm not going to bother to try to add anything to that. However, if you want to discuss this, of course, the panel discussion that'll be going on in here tomorrow, I think we'll go into a lot of that. So what is a mystical experience? Sense of unity or oneness or interconnectedness, strong sense of sacredness or reverence, a noetic quality, which is a sense of encountering the ultimate reality, deeply felt positive mood, universal love or joy, or really strong feeling of love and connection with those people that are around you at that time, or for the rest of your life with those people. Transcendence of time and space. Peter Hendricks was just talking quite a bit about transcendence in the little lecture right before mine. And then ineffability, or it's hard to put into words to explain what has happened to you. Chemistry of psilocybin and psilocin. What's happening to me when I eat these things? So psilocin is actually the compound that's active in you. Psilocybin is a much more tough molecule and not really the active compound. But it comes from the tryptophan pathway, which is a common pathway for catabolism of a lot of compounds in organisms. This is a very common amino acid in probably all life. Certainly all mammals have tryptophan, and then branching off into tryptamine and other compounds is a common pathway. So this is probably a step along the way to make all sorts of other things in the organism. I don't think this is like an end product necessarily. So the compound there with the green arrow, that's psilocin. That's the one that, after ingestion of psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin is dephosphorylated in the presence of acid in your stomach and turned into psilocin, and that's the active compound. Okay, so a little bit about the taxonomy, and then I'll show you some pretty pictures, and then that'll be pretty much the end. Okay, so I was asked by Peter Hendricks earlier, when I talk to people about active species, I've gotten into arguments, or maybe didn't say arguments, but he's been questioned about, are all Psilocybe species active? And it's kind of confusing because some are not. Well, turns out that just recently taxonomists decided that in order to perpetuate confusion, and plus there was DNA sequence analysis that showed that all the Psilocybe mushrooms, there was really sort of two groups that weren't super close relatives. One group was actually more closely related to another group of mushrooms, and the active group was more closely related to a different group of mushrooms. So the problem was the active ones, that group did not contain the type species, Psilocybe montana, which that's where the name comes from. That was the type species. So the big conundrum was, do we take the name Psilocybe away from the type species, which is just not done, or to avoid confusion, do we keep the active species that doesn't have that type species? Do we let them keep the name Psilocybe because they contain psilocybin? And this actually took quite a lot of wrangling and hand-wringing and arguments, and the taxonomists finally came to an agreement that the active species would retain the name Psilocybe, and the non-active ones would be called something else. They were put into a genus called Diconica, which really isn't a new name. That was a name used a long time ago for some of these, but they just sort of brought it back. If you see here on this phylogenetic tree, Ascomycetes way down here, all the Basidiomycetes up here, their common ancestor, and Mike Wood had a fantastic discussion just the other day about how phylogenetics works, and showed what we mean when we see these sort of phylogenetic trees. We can infer who begat whom, and even like how far back. So like before things were Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes, the common ancestor, which through speciation branched off into both forms, this was like 350 to 550 million years ago, so a long time ago. But these down here contain things like morels and cup fungi and things like that. And then these are all of the other Basidiomycetes, which includes this group up here, which are fairly recent arrivals, Stropharias and Psilocybes and things like that. Here's a bunch of rust brown spored mushrooms in here. These are all close relatives, but you see this group here contains inactive Psilocybes. This group here contains active Psilocybes. So the Psilocybes up here not active, they got moved into Diconica. And this was the type species of the genus Psilocybe montana, a mushroom that's very familiar to me. It's very common in the Midwest, especially growing with moss, this Polytrichum moss. If you still call it Psilocybe montana, that's fine. There's no other mushroom that's called that. But nowadays, people would more commonly call this Diconica montana. When Andy Wilson was giving the very first talk here, he was talking about some rare species he'd like to get his mitts on. One was Diconica coprophila, which I did just find on our early bird foray. But it's common around here. Wherever you have animals pooping, you'll see it. So you can see the little tag here. This is from the New Mexico Mycological Society. Oh, that's their logo. But anyways, if you went out in the woods and found poop, you'd probably find this on it. It's super common, Diconica coprophila. And in fact, you can see whoever labeled this wrote Psilocybe. So that's the story there. So in any case, if anyone asks you, all Psilocybes are active. If you want to call Diconicas inactive Psilocybes, that's fine too. You can call them whatever you want. You can call them Saliota for all I care. That's a very old genus name. It's funny if you're a mycologist. So here's some pretty pictures of some Psilocybes and some numbers on the activity. So if your only experience is collecting Psilocybe cubensis, I'll show how that stacks up in active compounds from some others. And these numbers mostly come from mycobute. So Psilocybe cubensis, everyone knows this mushroom because it's so easily cultivated, apparently, and widespread that everyone sees it. The Liberty cap Psilocybe semilanciata is more potent by weight than Psilocybe cubensis. In fact, most psilocybes that you've probably ever heard of are more potent than Psilocybe cubensis. It's not really that potent of a mushroom. This is a common mushroom in Europe, growing on lawns, and it's also seen sometimes on the West Coast in lawn areas. I think that I've seen it on the lawn outside of the Milwaukee Art Museum, strangely enough. So it kind of moves around, apparently, but it grows in lawn situations and rots debris there. Here's one of my favorite ones to see, just because they get quite large, but they're also very pretty too. And these are fairly easy to identify because they do have some certain things about their morphology. This is Psilocybe cyanescens, very common in the West Coast. You can find this in Golden Gate Park. You can find it in Vancouver Island City Park, which is where this photo was taken. Very pretty mushroom. Get fairly big for a psilocybe, you know, like the size sometimes of maybe like a coffee cup saucer. They can be quite big, but they have kind of a wavy margin, unlike most psilocybes. So that's why people call them wavies or wavy caps or any number of other names. And they're quite potent. These typically come out quite late in the year, and it also occurs on the East Coast too. Gary Linkoff had a very famous patch in Central Park where you would see tens of thousands of them fruiting. And you would probably see he scurrying around collecting them. Here's another picture. I think this is probably from Mike Wood, or is this yours, Mike, or Fred's?
I think that was Fred's.
I know this is from MycoWeb. 1% to almost 2% activity dry weight. So that's twice or more than twice as potent as Psilocybe cubensis. And this mushroom appears all over the place. It seems to pop up in unusual places, a lot of city parks. It's been at a few Namaphores. The one here in somebody's hand was at Namaphore in Scotts Valley near Santa Cruz. This was hilarious because, again, you can't put these out on a display table or mention them or anything at the Nama Annual Foray. Never mind, these big pots that this was fruiting in was in the display room. So, and these pots were going off like one after another. So one day they were fruiting out of the pot, great, and they get big. The pot goes missing, it's gone. The next day, another one is fruiting, and then it went away. It was like they were sort of mocking Nama. I would never mock Nama. So anyways, here was a funny situation at the nymph foray at Paul Smith's College, which was ironically enough where the Nama foray was just a few days ago. This photo was taken by Gary. Gary said, Britt, you would have loved to have been there. I wasn't at this. I've been to nymph forays a few times, but I was not at this one. Britt, you would have loved it. Everyone was in the lecture hall kind of like this, listening to some sort of a boring talk on mushrooms, kind of like this. And someone busts into the room and says, hey, everyone, there's psychedelic mushrooms out on the lawn. The room cleared. And that's when he took this photo. Yep. Yeah, just a couple more pretty pictures to show you. This is Psilocybe angustispora. It's one of the smallest ones, and it grows on elk pellets. So that shows you how tiny these little guys are. This photo was sent to me by Paul. So he sees these quite regularly out where he is. And I guess it's active, but just barely active. But anyways, it would take, bushels of them because they're super tiny, if you've ever seen an elk pellet. Here's a mushroom that if you go way back in time to the Telluride Mushroom Festival would know about this one, the Rock of Ages, or the Philosopher's Stone, Psilocybe tampanensis. This is a really unusual psilocybe for a few reasons. It's not really seen in nature maybe ever anymore. It was only seen a few times. But it also forms this underground tuber, kind of like a truffle almost, called a sclerotium. Sclerotia are sort of like an energy storage. A lot of mushrooms, even morels, pack nutrients and fats and things into sclerotia, and then when it's time to fruit, it's assumed then draw on these sclerotia. Well, in any case, I guess, as the story goes, when this was sort of found by Gary, at least for the first time that he saw it, He was grabbed at a Mycological Society of America conference down in Florida by Stephen Pollock. And they're sitting there in a boring lecture, wearing their suits and ties like everybody else. And Pollock's like, hey, Linkoff, let's blow this place. I got something to show you. So Stephen Pollock drove them out into the countryside, into a pasture, and they climbed over this rickety barbed wire fence. He's like, there's a mushroom here that's really freaky. And so they dug it up, and it had, this tuber attached to the bottom, and that's the mushroom known as Psilocybe tampanensis. It came from near Tampa, Florida. So all parts of the mushroom, including this underground sclerotium, is active, and you can see it staining blue there. I guess once the cops got wise to John Corbin bringing magic mushrooms to the Telluride Mushroom Festival a long time ago, I guess he could bring things like this in because it doesn't look like a mushroom. And so I guess insofar as Gary told me, he could walk around holding one of these in town with a potato peeler and slice off a piece for everybody and dose everyone in town. Can you confirm or deny any of that?
I don't know anything about it.
So if you see ads online like magic truffles, there's still, I think, some places in the Netherlands that sell magic truffles. There's no magic truffles. Truffles are an underground fruit body of a basidiomycete, or false truffles are the fruit body of, the other way around, ascomycete. But those are not psychedelic. The magic truffles come from this one mushroom, as far as I know, from Psilocybe tampanensis, and it's just the sclerotium of this psilocybin mushroom. Here's a very common, cute little Psilocybe in the Seattle area, or the Pacific Northwest area, let's say. It was first described from the University of Washington campus in Seattle, in fact, from right outside the door of the botany building where Daniel Stuntz worked. That's where it was first identified. It's common in mulch beds and gardens and things like that in the Pacific Northwest, called Stuntz's blue legs, Psilocybe stuntzii, which was sort of, the people that named it was sort of a poke in the eye of Daniel Stuntz, because he was strongly outspoken against psychoactive mushrooms. So, but it's very common. I see it every fall in the Pacific Northwest. Not particularly active. One that is extremely active is Psilocybe baeocystis. I don't see this too often. It seems to occur most often in pretty deep forests with moss, unlike what this photo would show. Anyways, it turns extremely blue, almost black. And it also has, in addition to psilocybin and psilocin, it also has baeocystin, which is also apparently a psychoactive compound. Probably most active of all, according to Paul Stamets, Psilocybe azurescens, and it's loaded with all kinds of goodies, evidently. I've never actually seen this one before in the wild. Whoever collected these had them kind of wrapped in a little paper towel, and you can see the juice bleeding out of these turn the paper towel blue. But it's a fairly attractive mushroom. Here's Psilocybe cyanofibrillosa. These photos were also sent to me by Paul. It's not very active, but it's kind of cool. And he sees these a lot, so he has a lot of photos of them. And this particular sequence shows the mushrooms one day growing out in the mountains or in a bed or something. And overnight there was a frost episode. And then when he went to them the next day, they were very, very blue, just from the environmental conditions sort of stressing them and causing the release of these compounds. So that's kind of cool. And then just one more, I think, to show you, Psilocybe hopii, which comes from around here in the Four Corners area. And this was in the Psilocybe issue, Fungi magazine. It's pretty poorly known and rarely seen. These were, in fact, the first color photos ever published of it. But it's a fairly large Psilocybe. Oh, I actually have a couple large ones to show after this, too. Fairly large Psilocybe from the southwest. One of the newest species is Psilocybe alleni, named for the myconaut John Allen that probably everyone knows. It was named by Alan Rockefeller, but not named for him, named for John Allen. This is from the Bay Area, used to be known as Cyanofriscosa, but now called Psilocybe alleni. Oh, yeah, and last but not least, my favorite of all the Psilocybe species, just because this is a common one in the Midwest and in the East, this is that Ovoideo cystidiata. In the Psilocybe issue, Michael Bugh wrote up a lot of information where a lot of species come from, and so he had this quote about this poorly known, poorly understood species that occurs in weird areas along stream banks in the East, and that comes from the original description, which was just in the 1980s, I think. In the Midwest to the East Coast, around springtime, I've personally seen it lots in Virginia, Washington, D.C., New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And it is quite potent, too. Furthermore, it gets moved around with mulch, so you're apt to see it in other places where humans have dwellings and things, like this water park that I mentioned before. This was out east. And also on the West Coast. I found this at the campus of UC Santa Barbara. I was walking around with a mycologist friend of mine who's a professor there, Bob Cummings. In fact, Bob Cummings was here one time to give lectures. And this was in the mulch right around one of the dormitories. I posted on Facebook the Fungi magazine page, because that's, of course, what you do. You brag about your mushroom finds, and said where it was found, and that, hey, students, when you return from break, you might have a surprise for you in the bed outside of your dorms. Instantly, there's all these questions. Which dorm exactly was this? So, and I didn't say what the name was. I just posted the picture, but obviously some students knew what this was. So again, ovoids occur all over the East Coast, growing naturally in the woods as well as in mulch areas. Here's a photo that John Plischke III took from Pennsylvania. And this is a photo of who's coming to dinner, Psilocybe. A couple of slides just to finish up on what's going on with research and legal business. And again, really not any details because we already had people talking about that. Psilocybin research basically was extinguished several decades ago, and only recently has it started to become, laws have become loosened a little bit to have research going on. But it is a Schedule I drug, which means it has no potential for medicinal purposes. It's dangerous and addictive, like heroin, which of course is preposterous. The mushrooms aren't really illegal according to the federal listing. It's the drug itself, so the mushroom is just a vessel for the drug. And because of that, since the spores don't contain the drug, it's legal, except in California, to have spore prints of this, to send them in the mail or whatever. If you're in California and you receive this, I'm not sure how a DEA agent would know what these are unless they know about microscopy and stuff. But anyways, that's the rules on all of that. The real sad thing about this is that when you look at all of the different drugs that humans seem to love to ingest, the most harmful drugs like alcohol and nicotine, and especially alcohol, there's no drug on the planet that's caused more carnage and loss of life, the ruination of families and property and all of these things than alcohol, and your government is actually in the business of peddling it to you and making money off of it. And the same with nicotine, and they're way up there at the top. All sorts of other drugs, much less dangerous to humans and property and your relatives and family. And the lowest in this study, which was published in The Lancet a few years ago, the lowest on the list of dangerous substances in this report was actually magic mushrooms. So that they're criminalized is just really nonsensical, frankly. But change is on the way. There are efforts to decriminalize magic mushrooms in some states, and here we are in Colorado, which really led the way. Awesome. And I guess there's still a movement afoot in Oregon and California. And one final thing is a plug for some places where it is legal, or at least look the other way. Places like Jamaica and a couple other islands in the South Pacific. If you don't know what Blue Portal is, do you know what Blue Portal is? Okay. If you don't know what it is, be sure to come to Trad Cotter's talk on Saturday night, and he'll tell you all about it. There's exciting things going on. He always has exciting things to tell us, but this is especially exciting. So I really like his logo. It has those blue eyes and that third one in the center. And what's pretty cool is that the eye logo is very similar to the logo of President Lincoln's campaign. This is what the Lincoln campaign logo looked like. I'm not making this up. Isn't that wild? Was Lincoln a proponent of mushrooms? I don't know. So, one other place where, of course, you're allowed to discuss these sorts of topics is right here at the Telluride Mushroom Festival. And this event's been going on for 39 years, and I really love this event. Couldn't be happier here. And fortunately, this is a mushroom picking zone. This is the sign you see when you come into town, maybe. Anyways, that's the end of my show. Most of the photos are mine, but I do borrow photos from a lot of people. So thanks to all of the people listed here for your photos, and thanks for your time. I think I ran over.